Good morning. The 10,057 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Estonia, Moldova, Norway, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Kayoko Goto, Director for Europe and Central Asia, and Officer in Charge for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas, Departments of Political and Peace-Building Affairs and Peace Operations. Ms. Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ambassador Tomasz Laurencic, Director of ITF, Enhancing Human Security, please. I have to. It is so decided. I understood the first. Okay.
In case anyone wants to object.
Okay. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Kayoko Goto.
Madam President, as the holiday season approaches, Ukrainian civilians are preparing to end yet another difficult year of war, without a ceasefire and with uncertain prospects for lasting peace. Despite cautious optimism around resumed diplomatic efforts, 2025 has been one of the deadliest for the people of Ukraine. Civilian casualties between January and November this year were 24% higher compared to the same period in 2024. These figures continue to increase as the Russian Federation escalates its aerial attacks across Ukraine. On the night of 5 and 6 December, dozens of civilians were injured and hundreds of thousands left without power and basic utilities, following large-scale Russian missile and drone strikes targeting energy and transport infrastructure in 10 regions across Ukraine. The night before, a 12-year-old boy was killed in a drone attack on a village in Dnipropetrovsk region. A week earlier, on 29 November, a massive Russian drone and missile attack reportedly killed 6 people and injured dozens of others in Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kherson regions. This attack also left more than 600,000 people in the Kyiv region without power under freezing winter temperatures. On 23 November, a drone strike on Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, reportedly killed 4 people. In total, since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified that 14,775 Ukrainian civilians, including 755 children, have been killed. 39,322 more, including 2,416 children, have been injured. These numbers only represent the verified casualties. Actual figures are likely significantly higher. The Russian Federation continues to target Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Systematic attacks on energy infrastructure in the middle of winter threaten to leave millions without reliable heating, water, and public transportation as temperatures drop. People in high-rise buildings cannot use elevators, which leaves the elderly and persons with disabilities trapped in their homes. This year alone, more than 340 educational facilities in Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed, depriving children of their right to education. Local authorities from frontline communities of Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Sumy regions reported that access to essential services had collapsed. Food shops and pharmacies are closed, medical personnel has left, and electricity cuts have lasted for more than 2 years in some areas. These deprivations, in addition to the horrors of daily indiscriminate attacks, are driving further large-scale displacements. At the same time, local authorities from communities across the border in the Russian Federation also continue to report new civilian casualties from regular attacks launched by the Ukrainian armed forces. Damage to civilian infrastructure is also reported as a result of long-distance Ukrainian strikes on military and energy sites in the Russian Federation. Due to lack of access and limited public information, the United Nations is not in a position to verify these reports. As has been stressed at all our briefings, I reiterate that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, are prohibited under international law. No matter where they occur, they are unacceptable and must stop. My colleague from the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs will share more information about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and the UN response through the meantime. Madam President, the United Nations has repeatedly warned against any action that could further escalate or expand this devastating war, now well in its fourth year. Following repeated alleged violations of airspace of several European countries, we are following with concern the recent reported incidents involving shipping and port infrastructure in the Black Sea. On 5 December, Bulgarian authorities launched efforts to evacuate the crew of an oil tanker that caught fire off the Black Sea port of Aktopol. This was one of the 2 Russian tankers reportedly hit on 29 November by Ukrainian naval drones in the Turkish economic zone. Earlier, in a separate incident on 2 December, another Russian-flagged tanker on its way from Russia to Georgia allegedly came under a drone attack off the Turkish coast. There have also been reported Russian attacks on port infrastructure in the Ukrainian port of Odessa, as well as alleged Ukrainian attacks on the Azov Sea port of Temryuk in Russia's Krasnodar region. While no casualties were reported, these incidents represent yet another step in the current dangerous cycle of escalation. We continue to urge all concerned to de-escalate tensions and to prevent the risk of further expansion of this conflict. This certainly also applies to the immense danger the war poses to nuclear sites. Despite the efforts by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, to restore power lines at Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the plant continues to experience dangerous power interruptions as a result of ongoing attacks in its vicinity, including, most recently, during the Russian attack on 5 and 6 December. IAEA has also conducted a comprehensive safety assessment of the new safe confinement at the Chernobyl site, which was severely damaged in the drone strikes in February. According to the assessment, the confinement had lost its primary safety functions, including the confinement capability. No permanent damage to its load-bearing structures or monitoring system was, however, found. Any military actions endangering the safety and security of nuclear plants are unconscionable, irresponsible, and must immediately cease. Madam President, we remain deeply concerned about systematic violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in the areas of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation, as reported by OHCHR. These violations undermine the principles of international humanitarian law set to safeguard human dignity and the protection of civilians. We recall the international obligations with regards to treatment of prisoners of war, including related to access to information regarding their places of detention. We are encouraged by the earlier exchanges of prisoners of war between Ukraine and the Russian Federation and urge their continuation, as well as scaled-up returns of Ukrainian children and civilian detainees without delay. Madam President, since the beginning of the full-scale war nearly 4 years ago, the people of Ukraine have not only shown remarkable resilience to endure the horrible consequences of the war, but also determination to build a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous future for their country. We have seen this consistently in the action of Ukrainian civil society, in particular organizations led by women and young people. People of Ukraine want peace that is just and lasting. Meeting their aspirations and enduring the long-term stability of the region must remain our collective focus and priority. That is why we remain hopeful that ongoing diplomatic efforts led by the United States can help bring this war to a negotiated end. The Secretary General has repeatedly called for a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire, immediate de-escalation in fighting, including a halt to ongoing attacks on critical civilian infrastructure, would not only spare civilian lives, but also bring added momentum to ongoing diplomatic efforts. We urge all stakeholders to actively engage in and support an inclusive diplomatic process in pursuit of a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Achieving a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine requires that any settlement fully upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and is in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions. The United Nations remains ready to support all meaningful efforts to this end. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank Ms. Goto for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Madam President, members of the Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council again on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. In the 2.5 weeks since our last update, intense missile and drone attacks across Ukraine have continued to exact a worrying toll on civilians. These strikes, many conducted at night during freezing temperatures, continue to kill and injure civilians, sever essential services, and undermine the lifelines that civilians rely on. Madam President, allow me to share what this means on the ground in humanitarian terms. In recent days, strikes have hit critical energy infrastructure in Kharkiv, Odessa, and the Dnipro region. Repair teams cannot keep pace with the damage. In several oblasts, rolling blackouts of 12 to 18 hours are cutting heat and water to entire apartment blocks. In Odessa, a missile strike last week destroyed a substation supplying power to several neighborhoods, including a displacement center. Attacks last week also hit residential buildings in Kharkiv, Sumy, and Zaporizhia, killing and injuring civilians, including children, continuing the patterns documented in our previous briefings. Across Donetsk and Kharkiv oblasts, authorities and humanitarian partners have accelerated voluntary evacuations from communities where repeated shelling has made it impossible to guarantee even minimal services. In areas around Prokhovsk, already highlighted in our November briefing, winter has compounded needs. Older people, people with disabilities, and families with young children are increasingly seeking evacuation after days without heat, clean water, or stable power. Some communities are facing sub-zero temperatures in damp shelters, many of which damaged from previous strikes. In Liman, where roughly 3,000 civilians were already out of reach of regular assistance, attacks have further restricted movement. Local volunteers told us last week that families are rationing humanitarian supplies. Madam President, energy infrastructure has been targeted in Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and winter sharply raises the stakes. Each damaged substation, heating pipeline, or pumping station risks cascading failures with grave repercussions for the well-being of civilians. In Kherson, a strike last week damaged a heating plant serving thousands of residents. A doctor from the nearby clinic shared with our team, and I quote, "People can survive without electricity for a time, but not without heat. Without heat, our elderly patients decline within hours," end of quote. WHO has verified hundreds of attacks on healthcare this year, attacks which kill, injure, and cripple health services when illnesses, hypothermia risks, and trauma cases surge. International humanitarian law is unequivocal. Civilians and civilian objects, wherever they are, must be protected, and constant care must be taken to spare them. Indiscriminate attacks, including attacks that cause disproportionate incidental death or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects, are strictly prohibited. As the 22nd meeting of states parties to the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention concluded last week, it is timely to renew the UN's grave concern over states' intention to withdraw from this treaty and the concerning retreat from international humanitarian law this represents. Anti-personnel landmines protect no one. Madam President, humanitarian partners continue to deliver assistance whenever and wherever access allows. Over recent weeks, winter clothing, blankets, and thermal supplies have been pre-positioned in frontline oblasts, and community points have been established to provide civilians with access to heat, electricity, and basic services during outages. Collective centers have been expanded for families arriving through evacuation corridors. Mobile health teams are traveling to areas experiencing prolonged outages. And interagency convoys continue to deliver food, water purification tablets, medical supplies, and shelter materials. So far this year, 44 convoys have reached 50,000 civilians in the hardest to reach communities along the front line. But access to some frontline areas remains extremely challenging. Active hostilities, damaged roads, and security restrictions regularly delay or suspend humanitarian operations. Humanitarian personnel facing rising dangers. In December so far, one aid worker was injured in Kherson region with 8 cases of damage to humanitarian offices, assets, and aid distribution sites, according to OCHA's Access Monitoring and Reporting Framework. As noted in our last briefing, a clearly marked UN convoy in Kherson was struck in October while attempting to deliver aid, underscoring growing dangers to aid workers. International humanitarian law also demands that humanitarian personnel and assets be protected. Engaging in dialogue with the relevant parties is essential to ensure they do not recur. Beyond these challenges, significant portions of the country remain out of humanitarian reach. While the UN does not have humanitarian operations in parts of Ukraine under occupation by the Russian Federation, our position is clear. We stand ready to deliver assistance to all civilians in need wherever they are, prioritizing solely on the basis of humanitarian need. Madam President, as winter deepens and access tightens, our ability to respond hinges on timely and sufficient funding. Yet funding shortfalls continue to constrain winter operations. Only 65% of the $279 million required for the winter response plan has been received, forcing cuts to the very services, cash assistance, heating support, mental health care, and protection for women and girls that are most critical in winter. The Global Humanitarian Overview released yesterday underscores the scale of these needs. 10.8 million people need assistance in 2026, and $2.3 billion is needed to target 4.1 million of them. The regional refugee response also remains substantial. Given this magnitude, even a modest shortfall leaves tens of thousands without the support they need for survival. Underfunding has a human cost. Families face freezing temperatures without heating support. Women and girls lose access to safe spaces, and older people in frontline communities are left without the means to evacuate. Madam President, today the humanitarian consequences are clear. Attacks harming energy systems are pushing cities toward blackout. Strikes in residential areas are uprooting families midwinter, and humanitarian access constraints are depriving the most vulnerable where suffering is highest. I urge you, members of the Council, to use the tools at your disposal, your voice, your influence, your unity where possible, to ensure 3 things. First, that the rules of war are upheld in practice, not only in principle, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Your collective influence on the protection of civilians carries weight. Second, and equally a matter of compliance with the rules of war, that safe, unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need be facilitated. When assistance is endangered, blocked, or delayed, the consequences are immediate and severe. Third, that humanitarian action is funded in line with the scale of need. Member state decisions will determine whether families face this winter with or without heat, medical care, and shelter. Madam President, the people of Ukraine do not have the privilege of waiting for better conditions. They are enduring a 4th winter since the escalation of this war, under fire and in the dark. What they need from this Council is not only sympathy, but concrete actions to reduce harm and safeguard the humanitarian action that stands between survival and catastrophe. Your actions in the coming weeks will influence whether this winter becomes another chapter of avoidable suffering or a moment when the Council helped prevent it. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Ambassador Tomasz Lovrencic.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council, allow me to express my sincere appreciation to the Slovenian Presidency for placing today's discussion on the agenda. I address you as the Director of ITF Enhancing Human Security, a humanitarian organization established by the government of Slovenia that has worked for nearly 3 decades in conflict-affected countries to clear mines, assist victims, and help communities recover. Today, however, I speak as an eyewitness to the ongoing tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. Just a few weeks ago, I visited Ukraine together with Dr. Aleš Musar, the spouse of the President of Slovenia. During this visit, I sat with victims of mines and explosive remnants of war, men, women, and children, whose lives were irreversibly changed after the Russian aggression in a single devastating moment. Their injuries were among the most severe I have seen in my career. Many have lost one and some both legs. Others bore terrible wounds across their bodies, including devastating trauma to their head and face. ITF has worked in numerous war-affected countries and has helped thousands of survivors receive prosthetics and psychosocial support. Yet what I witnessed in Ukraine marks a grim new chapter in the evolution of mine injuries. Because of the changing nature of the war, the pattern of injuries is also changing. In the past, most victims in mine-affected countries were injured from below, by stepping on a device buried in the ground. Today, in Ukraine, injuries increasingly come from above. The massive and systematic use of explosive drones has effectively moved minefields into the air. In addition to minefields on the ground, we now face what can only be described as minefields in the sky, indiscriminately killing and maiming civilians. This shift has catastrophic humanitarian consequences. Drone-delivered explosives strike the upper body, causing brutal injuries to the arms, hands, face, and head. And let me be very clear, the loss of a hand or an arm is often even harder to overcome than the loss of a leg. A prosthetic leg restores mobility. A prosthetic arm must replace fingers, one of the most complex tools of human life. Without hands, a survivor cannot dress independently, cannot prepare food, cannot perform basic daily tasks, and cannot even manage the most intimate aspects of their life without assistance. We often believe that mine warfare cannot sink lower, yet in Ukraine it is. Drone-delivered explosives are more indiscriminate, more dehumanizing, and more lethal. They cause injuries that are harder to treat, harder to rehabilitate, and harder for survivors and their families to endure physically, psychologically, and socially. This must matter to this Council, not only because of the enormous scale of suffering, but because the situation in Ukraine is a warning. If the international community does not mobilize now, this minefield in the sky risks becoming a horrifying standard in future conflicts. For this reason, I appeal to this Council and the international community for 3 urgent steps. First, sustained and increased support for humanitarian demining, including the development and deployment of new technologies and accelerated clearance operations. Second, extended support for victim assistance, not as an afterthought, but as an essential pillar of humanitarian response. Third, continued insistence, based on international humanitarian law, that weapons causing indiscriminate and disproportionate harm to civilians must stop. Protecting civilians is not optional. It is a legal and moral obligation. What Ukrainian people are suffering today might turn against all of us if we do not take action. Excellencies, upper body injuries bring a new, sad dynamic to this war on Ukraine. We are now witnessing a dramatic increase in civilians suffering devastating trauma to their arms, hands, and heads. The scale is alarming. Today, in addition to tens of thousands of amputees, there are already tens of thousands of newly deaf people as a direct result of blast injuries to the head and ears. Thousands more now require prosthetic arms and hands, complex and expensive medical devices that are essential for regaining independence. This represents not only a profound humanitarian challenge, but a tragic testimony to the cruelty of this aggression and to the depth of suffering endured by victims and their families. This is the new horror of war. I therefore appeal to this distinguished Council. Do everything in your power to stop this war. And if this cannot be achieved immediately, then at least act to limit harm from the air. The emergence of minefields in the sky must not be allowed to take root. If it is not stopped, hundreds or even thousands of civilians, including women and children, will continue to be subjected to lifelong suffering. What we see today in Ukraine may tragically be repeated elsewhere tomorrow, against all of us. Excellencies, let me conclude. Helping mine victims costs money. We are deeply grateful to all donor countries. In case of ITF, our projects in Ukraine are supported by Slovenia, Republic of Korea, and the United States of America, although the number of donors remains too small for the magnitude of the need. Greater burden sharing is needed, and I call on all countries to join the effort now. A prothesis is namely not a simple technical device replacing a missing limb. A high-quality prosthetic arm is a pathway back to normal life, a step towards independence, towards the dignity of being able to work, care for one's family, and contribute to one's community. It is a recognition that person's future is worth fighting for. Therefore, I call on all countries to support prosthetics in Ukraine at the highest possible standard, guided by humanity, solidarity, dignity, and justice. We have a chance to help the people of Ukraine now, at the moment when they need it most. Let us seize this opportunity and let history record that when confronted with extraordinary human suffering, we chose not caution or prudence, but humanity and solidarity at its fullest. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ambassador Lovrencic for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia. First, I thank the briefers for the valuable information they provided and for setting the tone to this discussion. Dear Council members, it will soon be 4 years since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Almost 4 years since it started an open war of aggression against its sovereign and significantly smaller neighbor. 4 years of open and repeated violation of international law. And 4 years of devastation, of shattered lives and dreams, and lost livelihoods. 4 years of destruction of schools, hospitals, and homes. They are not just mere words, but the harsh realities created by Russia's war. A month ago, I was on a field trip to several regions in Ukraine, and I have seen the horrors firsthand. I witnessed a generation of young people whose lives will be forever marked by this invasion. I have seen children being raised in an environment where shelters and air raid alarms are parts of daily life. Yet, in spite of the ongoing war, they continue to demonstrate resilience that deserves recognition and support. But more than that, they deserve to live in peace. Dear delegates, this is not the first time the Security Council has found itself facing a protracted conflict. However, we cannot leave and allow the value of human lives to decrease with each anniversary of the war. We object to Russia's escalation of the war while peace talks are underway. Russia continues to escalate its war. Swarms of drones are growing larger. Ballistic missiles are flying farther away from the front line, and we have even seen airspaces of other countries violated. On the receiving end of all these are civilians. Violence against them is visibly on the rise. In 2025, the number of civilian casualties rose for more than a quarter compared to last year. And as winter is setting in, the weakest parts of society continue to bear the brunt of the war. Civilians are in a dire need of an end to hostilities, and it is our responsibility to respond to a dire situation on the ground. We have reliable data provided to us by the briefers. We have trustworthy information from the UN presence in the country. As Council members, we must speak against blatant violations of humanitarian international law, speak against abductions and forcible transfers of children, condemn territorial conquest, and denounce the erosion of the foundation of this very organization. Ambassadors, this war needs to end. As a first step, both sides should urgently agree to a full and unconditional ceasefire. 14 members of this Council keep demanding it. Ukraine has agreed to it months ago. We reiterate our call on Russia to do the same. Only with an end to the fighting, meaningful peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine can take place. And only then a just peace can be achieved. A peace firmly rooted in the principles of the UN Charter, a lasting peace for Ukraine, shaped by Ukraine. And until then, Slovenia will continue to stand by Ukraine. And it will keep calling for peace and demanding respect for international law across the board by everyone, everywhere, at all times. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me also thank the briefers for sharing their insights. Before addressing the latest wave of Russian attacks on Ukraine, as described by our briefers, let me first reaffirm several fundamental principles that we believe must define a viable path to peace in Ukraine. First, Denmark called for an immediate ceasefire. It is the only credible first step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with international law, including the UN Charter. A ceasefire could allow for much-needed trust building between the parties, while lending hope for an urgently needed break from war for the civilian population. Second, Ukraine needs credible and robust security guarantees. Ukrainians must be able to live in confidence that the nightmare they are currently enduring will not repeat itself. Third, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. This peace has to be driven for and with Ukraine. And of course, the region also has to be involved. When European security is on the table, Europe has to be at the table. Denmark appreciates the efforts of the United States to bring peace to Ukraine and fully supports all efforts to reach a peace agreement in Ukraine based on these principles. principles that uphold Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity as enshrined in the UN Charter. It is often claimed in this chamber that Europe is prolonging the war by supporting the defense of Ukraine. That is not the case. We support Ukraine because its people are dying at the hands of their much larger neighbors' aspiration to change borders with brute force. For the sake of Ukraine, and for the sake of European and international peace and security, we cannot allow Russia to benefit from such deplorable actions. Madam President, turning to the developments on the ground, our briefers have been clear. Russia's attacks have continued unchecked and unabated. At this critical moment, the international community must stand with Ukraine. The country has entered its fourth winter since the launch of Russia's full-scale invasion. With months of freezing temperatures ahead, Russia is intensifying its attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Such attacks are a clear violation of international humanitarian law. As we've heard this morning, Russian bombs keep falling over cities and civilian infrastructure, destroying access to electricity, heating, and clean drinking water. While the world calls for peace, Ukraine is experiencing massive airstrikes and power outages for hours on end every single day. Last week, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution condemning Russia's illegal abduction of Ukrainian children in the temporary occupied territories. We reaffirm that condemnation today. It was relieved to learn that 7 children were recently reunited with their families in Ukraine. We stress that all children must be reunited with their families immediately and without conditions. Children should never be subject to such inhumane treatment, nor should they be used as political bargaining chips. We call for all perpetrators to be held accountable. Madam President, Russia's actions leave us in no doubt that it is not serious about peace. While Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire long ago, Russia continues to dismiss any such calls and persistently reiterates unacceptable demands. Just last week, President Putin confirmed that Russia will seize the Donbas region by any means. Let us be clear. Russia is seeking the capitulation of Ukraine. Madam President, in closing, the Ukrainian people have suffered too much for too long. They deserve to return to their homes and to rebuild their lives and their country in peace and prosperity. Denmark remains steadfast in our support to this objective. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. Panama is grateful for the invaluable information shared by Ms. Kayoko Goto, officer in charge of the Europe, Central Asia and the Americas Division in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. We're also grateful for the briefing from Ms. Joyce Misuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. We're finally grateful for the briefing given by Tomasz Lorencic, Director of ITF Enhancing Human Security. We take note of the presence of the representatives of the delegations that do us the honour of attending our meeting today. We are meeting once again to analyse the consequences of the war in Ukraine as the 4th year of hostilities draws to a close. Panama here reaffirms its concern for the civilian population that continue to disproportionately suffer under the daily drone and missile attacks. Consequently, a cessation of hostilities and the cessation of attacks on civilian areas is urgent and cannot be postponed. We have reiterated this appeal on several occasions in this chamber, and the result is indifference towards compliance with international law and international humanitarian law. Another result is clear violations of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. Allowing this war to drag on, moreover, erodes the legitimacy of the fundamental purpose of this organization. It was designed precisely to spare humankind from the scourge and suffering of war. Honoring the principles of the Charter requires that we step up our efforts in endeavors that promote the restoration of international peace and security in Europe. We must also focus on efforts to revive hope of peaceful coexistence between Russians and Ukrainians. Cracks in international security that have emerged as a result of this conflict erode trust in the international community. They threaten the future of entire generations and condemn them to suffer the trauma of a war which, if there were a desire to do so, could be immediately stopped. Panama repeats here its appeal for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We also call for the opening of a genuine dialogue on the part of those that have the responsibility to end this war. We do so with the firm conviction that it is only in that way that we will be able to safeguard the principles that underpin the peaceful coexistence between nations and the international rule-based order. We recognize diplomatic efforts designed to achieve a peace agreement. It is vital to make progress with a constructive process which rebuilds trust between the parties and lays the foundations for stability. This journey demands mutual respect and must be guided by the shared will, the shared desire to build a lasting peace. President, history has shown us that peace has always been possible when there has been a desire to achieve it. The suffering that we are witnessing among brotherly peoples is not an inevitable act of fate. It is rather the result of human decisions. Putting an end to this war requires will, readiness, consistency, and bravery. Panama urges all actors involved to prioritize the respect for life over and above geopolitics and to demonstrate that dialogue can prevail over force. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank the briefers for their input. In the course of another winter, the scourge of this illegal war of aggression ravages Ukraine. The calls of the overwhelming majority of this Council for an immediate ceasefire remain unheeded by Russia, as our briefers' accounts have made clear. Since our last meeting, almost 20 days ago, Russian attacks have intensified and civilian casualties have numbered in thousands following strikes in residential buildings and other civilian facilities in densely populated areas. Amid plunging temperatures, Russia continues its strikes targeting critical energy infrastructure, causing widespread blackouts and leaving homes without the essentials for survival. Such actions constitute clear violations on international humanitarian law and may account to war crimes. Children are also of major concern to us. They should be particularly protected as the Convention of the Rights of the Child and its optional protocol recognize them as uniquely vulnerable victims. In this regard, we welcome the adoption of the General Assembly resolution on the return of Ukrainian children, deploring Russian actions, demanding their immediate, safe, and unconditional return, and providing the Secretary General with a comprehensive mandate to ensure their return. We urge Russia to respect the UN membership's call. At the same time, we are fully aware that in Ukraine, the rights of children to life, health, psychosocial development, education, and identity are violated on a daily basis. According to UNICEF, 4.6 million Ukrainian children continue to face major disruptions to education. There have been more than 340 attacks on schools this year alone, while more than 4,300 educational institutions have been affected in total. Mr. President, despite soon entering the 5th year of war, Ukraine and its people persevere. They defend their freedom and independence with courage, conviction, and resilience. This Council and this organization should not fail them. In that respect, Greece welcomes the progress on a peace plan made at the Geneva and Florida meetings between the US and Ukraine delegations. We reiterate that there can be no agreement about Ukraine and Europe without Ukraine and Europe. We also call on Russia to engage in good faith and abandon its maximalist demands. Greece will always side with international law, the UN Charter, and the principles of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity enshrined therein. We unequivocally reject any change of borders as a result of the use of force. There can be no recognition of borders changed by force. That would constitute a blatant violation of international law and set a dangerous precedent. The principled stance guides our position on the war of aggression against Ukraine, along with our strong belief that the guns should be silenced for the voice of peace to be heard. In this respect, Greece joins the call of the wider UN membership in support of a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire as the primary goal and the first step of a process leading to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Lastly, Mr. President, we reiterate that Ukraine must have the final word for its future, equipped with credible security guarantees. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. Goto, ASG Umsuya, and Director Lovrenchik for their timely briefings, and welcome the representatives of Ukraine and other European countries. But, Mr. President, once again, we were reminded today by the briefers the freezing winter and frigid conditions themselves are being weaponized, along with deeply concerning and escalating deadly attacks on power and heating supplies. This is unleashing painful repercussions on long-suffering communities. Regretfully, such attacks are transpiring despite the international communities, including this Council's vocal calls for swift end to the ongoing fighting and a lasting peace agreement. In this light, I'd like to expand on the following points. First, the Republic of Korea reiterates its call for all relevant parties to immediately halt the attacks on energy infrastructure and civilian population centers. Such attacks, carried out with massive drones and missile swarms that continue to on near daily basis, are why the UN is warning of a catastrophe within a catastrophe. These attacks constitute a clear violation of the international humanitarian law, as articulated in Article 54 of the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, as they targeted civilian infrastructures indispensable to the survival of the civilian populations. Civilians should not be targeted and must be protected under the international humanitarian law. This situation should not persist any further. Second, even if the humanitarian situation were to be improved, we emphasize without end to the war. Such improvement would be merely temporary. In this connection, the Republic of Korea is supportive of ongoing U.S. leadership to advance dialogue with your view to pursuing rapid and tangible steps toward a peace plan that can ensure lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine. We note with attention that diplomatic efforts to halt this senseless loss of life have seen positive developments in recent weeks. We take this opportunity to implore all key leaders and stakeholders to do all they can do, foster sustainable peace and save lives at this particularly vital juncture for the region and the world. Third, we cannot overlook the fact that one of the key obstacles to ending this war is the Russian and DPRK military cooperation, which include illicit arms and ballistic missile transfers and troop deployment. This cooperation continues to prolong the conflict and facilitate its progression to that of global scope in a manner that both dangerous and unpredictable. This is clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter and multiple Council resolutions, and undermines the global non-proliferation regime. My government once again strongly urges Russia and DPRK to immediately cease their unlawful military cooperation. Mr. President, we must not allow people of Ukraine to endure yet another harsh winter, and we must collectively reinvigorate all efforts for peace. For its part, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its full commitment to ending this war and standing with Ukrainian people as they rebuild their country and project a brighter or more secure future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I welcome Her Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia, presiding over today's meeting. I thank the briefers for their briefings. The Ukraine issue has now entered a critical phase towards a negotiated settlement. Discussions at international level are increasingly converging on negotiation, moving closer to peace. Major stakeholders have put forward a number of proposals for peace talks and engaged on different occasions. China welcomes such progress, supports all efforts leading up to peace, and hopes the international community will work together for an early political settlement of the crisis. First, joint efforts must be made to advance the peace talks. Peace talks cannot happen overnight. China has noted that relevant parties have recently put forward their positions and concerns on key issues. We call on parties concerned to seize the most positive momentum, move toward each other, demonstrate political will, and continue to build up consensus to strive for a fair, lasting, and binding peace agreement as soon as possible. Second, collective action is required in the protection of civilians. Despite resounding calls for peace, hostilities on the ground remain unabated, leading to a succession of new casualties and infrastructure damage and destruction, which are profoundly worrying. China urges the parties concerned to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint, rigorously comply with international humanitarian law, and effectively ensure the safety of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call on the international community to step up humanitarian assistance to help affected populations tide over their hardships. Third, uniting in efforts to create an European security architecture. While parties concerned had reached the Minsk and New Minsk agreements, the Ukraine crisis eventually erupted. The underlying reason being the failure to properly address their respective security concerns and tackle the root causes of the conflict. Any new peace agreement must draw from this lesson. China calls on all parties to uphold the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, bear in mind the principle of indivisible security, and take seriously and properly address their respective legitimate security concerns, especially the root causes of the conflict, to establish a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is objective, impartial, and consistent. That is, calling for a ceasefire and cessation of fighting, facilitating peace talks, and promoting a political settlement. Guided by the 4 shoulds proposed by President Xi Jinping, we maintain that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter be observed, the legitimate security concerns of all parties be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to a peaceful resolution of the crisis be supported. China has stayed in close contact with all parties concerned, including Russia and Ukraine, actively engaging in shuttle diplomacy. China, alongside Brazil and others, launched the Group of Friends for Peace on the Ukraine crisis, working unwaveringly to amplify calls for peace and foster consensus for peace. China will continue to play a constructive role in advancing a political resolution of the crisis. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
I thank you, Madam President. I also thank Ms. Goto, ASG Masuya, and Ambassador Lovrencic for their briefings. Regrettably, the conflict in Ukraine continues to rage, upending the lives and livelihoods of millions over the course of the past almost 4 years. Pakistan has consistently expressed its profound concern on the impact that this conflict has had on regional and international security and the resulting immense human suffering. We are deeply perturbed by the continued fighting and targeting of civilians and civil infrastructure. As we have said in the past, protection of civilian lives and infrastructure is a legal obligation and should remain paramount. We reiterate our call for all sides to uphold the principles of international humanitarian law, including on the protection of humanitarian aid workers. Madam President, Pakistan remains an ardent supporter of the peaceful resolution of this conflict. We have always advocated an early cessation of hostilities, de-escalation, and a sustained and meaningful dialogue which addresses the legitimate security concerns of all sides to bring this protracted conflict to an end. We welcome the renewed momentum towards peace and diplomatic engagements led by the United States. We call upon the parties to exercise restraint, demonstrate political will, and earnestly engage for making meaningful strides towards a mutually acceptable settlement, a solution acceptable to all relevant parties, grounded in the UN Charter, international law, and relevant multilateral agreements, is essential to bring peace, which is durable and lasting. Towards this end, we hope that all sides would be guided by sagacity, mutual understanding, and above all, the imperative for saving millions from further suffering. To conclude, Madam President, Pakistan stands ready to support all endeavors aimed at resolving the issue peacefully and in a just, comprehensive, and durable manner. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President Fayon, and thank you for chairing this important meeting today. I would also like to thank our three briefers. Ending the Russia-Ukraine war remains a top priority for President Trump. Under his leadership, the United States is working at all levels to urgently end hostilities through a permanent ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. The United States is engaged in tireless shuttle diplomacy to try and bridge the divide between Moscow and Kyiv. We also want to move the parties toward a negotiated set of terms for ceasefire. These discussions are complex and difficult, but thankfully they are ongoing. Both sides will need to make difficult choices to end the war. Our goal is an end to the war and a mutually agreed peace deal that leaves Ukraine sovereign and independent and with an opportunity for real prosperity. It remains critical to keep an international focus, and this Council must continue to focus on this war. The United States will follow President Trump's leadership towards peace and deploy all available tools to reach a ceasefire and a final negotiated peace agreement. I call on Moscow and Kyiv to likewise follow President Trump's lead and stop the senseless loss of life. The death toll and the scale of destruction in both Ukraine and Russia only continues to grow. The rising humanitarian cost of this war, particularly against women and children, is unacceptable, and it will ripple through for decades across the region. Meanwhile, as the winter continues to grow colder and darker, strikes in populated areas and against Ukraine's energy grid continue, leaving millions without heat and power. The killing must stop. Both sides must choose peace. As we move into 2026, we report there is an ongoing and productive dialogue. But let us not miss this opportunity to secure a just and sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Ms. Kayoko Goto and Ms. Joyce Msuya for their briefings. I listened carefully to the remarks of Ambassador Tomasz Lawrence. Madam President, Algeria remains concerned about the ongoing conflict around Ukraine and the repeated military attacks which affect peace and security in the region. This conflict continues to impact the humanitarian situation, causing further loss of civilian lives and the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure. This is especially relevant in this winter period when civilians, particularly women and children, face increased suffering from severe weather conditions. Moreover, this conflict continues to have significant consequences, particularly for developing countries, which are dealing with an unprecedented energy and food security crisis. In this context, I would like to emphasize the following points. First, Algeria reaffirms the urgency of stopping hostilities and ending this conflict. We also reaffirm the paramount need to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure through the full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law. Equally crucial is facilitating humanitarian assistance without discrimination and ensuring it reaches all those in need. Second, we reiterate our call on both parties to prioritize dialogue and negotiations with the aim of advancing direct peace talks by intensifying diplomatic efforts and avoiding any action that can lead to confrontation or escalation. Third, establishing the conditions for an inclusive and comprehensive dialogue remains key to promoting a peaceful settlement of the conflict. We believe that polarization only leads to further prolonging and deepening the conflict, which carries numerous regional and international consequences. We therefore emphasize the need to reinforce all international efforts aiming to foster convergence, facilitate coordination, and bridge divergent positions among the parties. In conclusion, Madam President, Algeria reiterates its call for renewed engagement of the parties to achieve a just and lasting peace based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and taking into consideration their legitimate security concerns. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. Guyana thanks Ms. Goto and ASG Msuya for their briefings and welcomes the contribution of Ambassador Lovrencic. We also welcome the participation of Ukraine, Poland, Norway, Romania, Estonia, Moldova, and the European Union in the meeting. Today's meeting comes at a critical time as we are witnessing a notable increase in diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the nearly 4 years of active conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. A conflict that has been marked by violation after violation of international law from its inception, and which continues to have a devastating toll on the lives of civilians in both countries. Since Russia's violation of Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter and the territorial integrity of Ukraine in February 2022, we have consistently witnessed what can only be described as a wanton disregard for international humanitarian law and the established norms and principles that underpin the international legal order. Just recently, and even as the parties are engaged in peace talks, there was an increase in drone and missile strikes impacting civilian and critical infrastructure and resulting in the loss of civilian lives across several regions. Many of these attacks resulted in blackouts and compromised operations at nuclear power plants, putting nuclear safety at serious risk. Railway, port facilities, and oil refineries have also not been spared. These actions, taken at a time of renewed hope for achieving a peaceful solution, will further erode trust among the parties, undermine regional stability, and worsen the global climate of insecurity. As always, civilians continue to bear the heaviest brunt as the death toll climbs, and there is mounting displacement and the destruction of their homes and communities. Guyana continues to underscore that civilians are not collateral damage. Every life taken in the course of this war is one life too many. We call on the parties to take meaningful action to halt further violations, uphold their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to take constant care to spare civilians from harm. Moreover, we call upon the parties to the conflict to cease hostilities on humanitarian grounds as the peace talks continue, and to foster a conducive environment for the ongoing negotiations towards a definitive ceasefire. We urge the international community to support this call, recognizing that genuine progress toward peace is difficult to achieve under the current circumstances. The only viable path toward resolving the conflict peacefully lies in sustained dialogue, genuine engagement, a steadfast commitment to a diplomatic solution, and firm adherence to the established international norms. As the peace talks continue, we hope that they will lay the foundation for a future marked by stability and security for both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. The outcomes of these discussions must therefore be rooted in the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. We take positive notes of the recent comments indicating that some aspects of the peace negotiations have been both substantive and constructive. We hope that this spirit of cooperation and constructive engagement will endure, paving the way for a lasting and comprehensive end to the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, allow me to welcome you to New York and to assure you of France's full support as Slovenia takes up the presidency of the Council. I also wish to thank Ms. Kayoko Goto, officer in charge at the DPPA. I'd also like to thank Ms. Joyce Musuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and Ambassador Tomas Lovrencic. I thank you all for your enlightening briefings on a situation which unfortunately continues to worsen. As we speak, Madam President, the United States and Ukraine, together with Europeans, are stepping up their diplomatic efforts to seek a lasting solution that will put an end to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And at this very same moment, Moscow is stepping up its own offensive. Moscow is pushing against the front lines to annex more Ukrainian territory. Moscow is ratcheting up its mass and deliberate attacks against the people of Ukraine, against its energy infrastructure, against its railways and its ports. This in violation of international humanitarian law. The Ukrainian people is preparing to face its fifth consecutive winter under Russian bombs, deprived of heating and electricity. But given that Russia is not succeeding in breaking Ukraine's resistance, it's playing for time. President Putin does not hide that fact when he speaks about liberating territory with the force of weapons if the Ukrainian army doesn't withdraw. And should we need to remind it, he talks about territory snatched from Ukraine by force, the territory that has been illegally occupied. It's clear that he's not looking for peace. He's looking to defeat Ukraine and subjugate them. Russia is doggedly pursuing military escalation instead of seizing the opportunity of negotiations underway to heed the appeal of the vast majority of the international community, that of members of this Council and of the UN Secretary General, for a comprehensive, immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Madam President, this appeal for a ceasefire and de-escalation is more urgent than ever before. Russia must engage in good faith in negotiations, beginning by laying down its weapons, instead of playing for time with tactics which simply allow the war to drag on and which ultimately deceive no one. These negotiations must continue by taking into account the interests of those most affected. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Nothing about the security of Europeans without the Europeans. Madam President, France is doing its part for peace. It is working alongside Ukraine, its European partners and the United States to build security guarantees that are vital for a just and lasting peace. This peace cannot involve the capitulation of the aggression's victim. It must protect Ukraine's sovereignty, its ability to exercise its right to self-defense and to prevent any further aggression. That is the premise underpinning the meeting held yesterday in London between the leaders of France, Germany, the UK and the Ukrainian head of state. It was also the premise underpinning the meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, held in the presence of the US and Ukraine on the 25th of November. In the coming days, we will continue to closely work with all of our partners based on the above premise, and we will continue to step up efforts to compel Russia to allow peace. Madam President, France recalls its tireless support for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Beyond European security and global stability, it is the very preservation of the fundamental principles of our Charter which is at stake. France will continue tirelessly with its partners to support Ukraine over the long haul and will continue to work relentlessly for a lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President, Your Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia. I thank Ms. Kayoko Goto and ASG Joyce Msuya for their informative briefings. I also thank Ambassador Tomas Lovrencic for his contribution. 1,384 days into this conflict, the civilian population continues to bear the brunt of ground and aerial attacks in Ukraine. We therefore urge the parties to prioritize dialogue and engage in good faith diplomatic negotiations in pursuit of ceasefire leading to a lasting peace agreement and just peace. As the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine deepens with the advent of a fourth severe winter, Sierra Leone reinforces the imperative for the immediate cessation of hostilities. In view of the foregoing, we will make 3 points. First, it is imperative that direct talks between the parties be held at the highest political levels to address the possibility of an immediate, unconditional ceasefire as the starting point for a just and lasting peace. For the better part of 2025, the United States have held diplomatic efforts between the two parties for a ceasefire agreement. We welcome these efforts and note the progress made towards the release and exchange of prisoners of war and civilian detainees and the return of Ukrainian children. These steps, as well as the fact that both parties continue to stay engaged in diplomatic processes at various levels, are all positive indications that there are opportunities at this moment in time for good faith negotiations on a ceasefire. These critical ongoing talks ultimately require participation from the highest political offices of both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. In this regard, we reiterate our support for a diplomatic solution in full respect for the Charter of the United Nations, especially the principles of sovereignty, independence, and the territorial integrity of states. In this context, Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Second, Sierra Leone continues to emphatically reiterate that deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited and amount to war crimes under international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, this conflict has been characterized by continuous deliberate airstrikes on heavily populated areas of Ukraine, with devastating consequences. These attacks on critical energy, water, health, and other civilian infrastructure continue to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Since 2022, Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been severely damaged, reducing generation and transmission capacity. It is reported that Ukraine has lost over 50% of its gas production capacity. This dramatic loss of energy capacity has resulted in power and heating cuts for millions of people across the country. With the onset of winter, vulnerable groups, especially older people and persons with disabilities, have been particularly affected by these disruptions in energy services. It is important that there is urgent and increased support for the Ukraine humanitarian response plan, including the winterization aid plans. Sierra Leone reiterates its call for the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Third, accountability and justice mechanisms for addressing human rights violations and war crimes committed during this conflict should be prioritized in pursuit of lasting peace. Verified reports from the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Independent International Commission for Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as other international and regional bodies, indicates breaches of international law and human rights violations, including the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian objects in military strikes, as well as extrajudicial killings, torture, sexual offenses, and the abduction of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. The reports have also verified incidents of abuse of both Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees, as well as Russian prisoners of war. Sierra Leone has consistently joined other members of the Security Council to call for full, fair, and impartial investigations into allegations of breaches of international law and gross human rights violations during conflict. We also urge all states to cooperate fully with the International Criminal Court. To conclude, Madam President, we are at a critical juncture in this conflict. The alarming civilian casualty figures and the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine underscore the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation. We urge the parties to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. We express our gratitude to the briefers for their comprehensive update. My delegation remains profoundly concerned by the continued deterioration of security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The ongoing hostilities serves only to prolong suffering and further diminish the prospect for a sustainable peace. We are deeply troubled by the continuous escalation of military action affecting civilians. The protection of civilians and the preservation of critical infrastructure are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold these principles without exception. Madam President, we remain convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the only means to bring this crisis to an end. In this regard, we welcome the recent renewal diplomatic engagement. Specifically, we welcome the meetings between the United States officials and the Russian Federation and Ukraine. These engagements represent a vital step toward a de-escalation, and we hope they will lay the groundwork for a constructive path forward. We call upon all sides to seize this diplomatic momentum, exercise utmost restraint, and commit to genuine negotiations. Durable solutions must address the root causes of the conflict and be consistent with the United Nations Charter. To conclude, Madam President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability in Ukraine. Ukrainian people and all those affected by this conflict deserve peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank our briefers for their presentations and I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine and other European countries at our meeting. Yesterday, my Prime Minister hosted President Zelensky, President Macron, and Chancellor Merz in London for talks in which we recommitted our support to safeguarding Ukraine's long-term security, sovereignty, and prosperity. The United Kingdom supports efforts, led by the US, to secure a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, including robust security guarantees, in line with the principles of the UN Charter. This is a war that President Putin started. He could, if he wished, end it at any time by ceasing his full-scale invasion. We continue to hope that Russia will engage seriously with peace talks. But despite the genuine efforts of partners to mediate, Russia's campaign against Ukraine has only intensified in its brutality. President, the facts speak for themselves. Between 18 November and 4 December, Russia launched nearly 3,000 drones and over 110 missiles at Ukrainian cities. This is a repeated pattern of Russian behavior, while President Putin claims he is engaging in good faith in peace talks. Since rejecting Ukraine's offer of an immediate and unconditional ceasefire on 11 March, Russia has killed over 1,850 Ukrainian civilians. And since peace talks began in May, Russia has launched the largest air attacks of the entire war. These are not the actions of a country sincerely interested, as President Putin claimed in August, in paving a path towards peace. President, the UN has reported this year that an estimated 12.7 million people in Ukraine need humanitarian support. Russia's strikes not only directly kill civilians, but they worsen a dire humanitarian crisis. Since the start of October, Russia has launched 9 mass air attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, reducing Ukraine's energy production capacity by 40% and causing nationwide blackouts lasting up to 16 hours a day. This is a deliberate weaponization of winter, plunging homes into freezing darkness and putting millions of vulnerable Ukrainian civilians at risk. We support President Trump and President Zelensky's efforts to secure a just and lasting peace. How many more civilians have to die before Russia accepts a ceasefire? I thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Madam President, today those who follow Security Council meetings about Ukraine will have yet another opportunity to witness this hypocrisy fair organized by our European colleagues so as to demonstrate their support for the regime in Kiev, no matter what. In practice, despite all of the organizers' efforts, today's meeting only serves to highlight how London, Paris, Berlin, and other European capitals are interested in the war continuing to the last Ukrainian. And this in order to try to weaken Russia as much as possible and to ensure that the anti-Russia project it launched in Ukraine in 2014 can be saved at any cost, a project that is now swiftly going bust. Russia has not only consistently tried to prevent this acute crisis of European security provoked by many years of NATO actions to this end, but since day one we expressed a willingness to pursue the objectives of the Special Military Operation, the SMO, which we were compelled to start in February of 2022, to pursue these through peaceful means. The aims contain nothing that any peaceable state wouldn't expect from its neighbors. I doubt that any of those who are shouting here in this chamber this hackneyed mantra about the Russian aggression against Ukraine would sit idly by if their neighbors used force to outlaw the identity of the people living on its territory, to glorify Nazi accomplices, to ban religions, to promote extreme nationalism, and to pursue an aggressive and provocative policy. Sooner or later, this would result in a serious crisis and an armed conflict. That's why, usually, neighboring states seek to resolve such contradictions through peaceful means, or even better, to prevent them arising in the first place. As a rule, the UN, regional organizations, as well as other neighbors help them to achieve this. However, this formula, due to the efforts of Western states, didn't work vis-à-vis Russia, despite the fact that for many years we've consistently warned about this impeding crisis. The backers of the regime in Kiev were oblivious to this information, all the while, as it turned out, arming the junta and preparing it for war with Russia, with the Minsk agreements providing cover. Thus, it comes as no surprise that the most stubborn among them are continuing to pretend that we started the special military operation in a vacuum, and that Ukraine doesn't have any problems which are threatening the very survival of the state. The reality, in fact, shows quite the opposite is true. I think there's no need to delve into the details of the root problems which Ukraine is confronting today, 12 years after an anti-constitutional coup d'etat orchestrated by Western capitals. Even the Western mass media is talking about this today, media outlets who preferred to stay silent for many years. Following the tectonic corruption scandals, which prompted a number of high-profile resignations, the former comedian and his European sponsors are doing all they can to pretend that the Kiev princeling himself knew nothing about these criminal plots. The truth about the repressive authoritarian system set up over many years in Ukraine is being hushed up, a system which resulted in thousands of political prisoners. Is there any other country in the world which can boast about legislative bans on a language spoken by the majority of its population, as well as unprecedented prosecution of a millennium-old canonical faith? And since when does Europe so proud of its European values, since when does Europe deem the aforementioned actions to be normal? The regime in Kiev has driven its own country not only to poverty and civil war, it's also turned Ukraine into a bargaining chip in a geopolitical confrontation between the West and Russia. Ukraine has already paid a horrific price for these criminal errors and blunders. Ukrainians are now being forced to pay an even higher price. Men who don't want to fight are being grabbed in the streets. They're being sent to a pointless fratricidal meat grinder. Can any of those who called today's meeting clarify why Ukrainians are being forced to fight against their will, when what we have on the table are fairly realistic proposals for long-term, lasting settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, something that our US colleagues are diligently working on? What are Ukraine's European sponsors trying to achieve? After all, they understand full well the disastrous consequences of the situation on the battlefield. After all, history relentlessly demonstrates that every new proposal being put before Ukraine is less favorable to it than the last, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of senseless losses which Ukraine has sustained due to the criminal actions of its leadership. Madam President, by forcing Ukrainians to fight and to reject peace terms it's being offered, Kiev's European backers are concerned, of course, not about the fate of Ukraine nor about its dignity. These are all fairy tales for pink ponies and guppy fish, as the Ukrainian blogosphere calls the credulous Ukrainian populace. What London, Paris, and Berlin seek is to win time to prepare for war with Russia. A mad idea, which in Brussels, the Brussels of NATO, and especially the Brussels of the EU, an idea which they're trying to turn into practically the only ideology, bringing together European states, distracting the European populace from socioeconomic and political problems which are being made worse by the errors and blunders of their own European leadership. Yet European politicians, which have gone mad in their Russophobia and powerlessness, are unconcerned by the fact that Russia isn't threatening anybody. that this topic, the topic of a future war, is being whipped up solely by them, consistently ignoring calls for dialogue and for solutions to the problems that have piled up in the sphere of European security, calls that today are being heard not only from Moscow, but also Washington. All of these Macrons, Starmers, Merzes, von der Leyens, and Callisters, are they really ready to follow in Ukraine's footsteps, to sacrifice their own ambitions at the altar, the European children on the altar of their own ambitions? Is the European populace really ready to believe these Russophobic, scary stories and to walk down this suicidal path which has led Europe to ruin at least thrice in the last 200 years? After listening to statements from our European colleagues in this chamber, there are more and more questions about whether European elites are in their right mind. Meanwhile, hopes of swift peace in Ukraine are increasingly ephemeral. It's clear Ukrainians, the overwhelming majority of which don't want to fight for a posse that has usurped power, Ukrainians will not be permitted to end this military madness. Instead of realistic ideas, calls, we got an earful of false assertions about so-called targeted Russian military strikes on Ukrainian civilian objects, although everyone in Ukraine knows full well that homes, hospitals, schools, and kindergartens, if they do suffer, they suffer solely as a result of the fact that Ukrainian air defenses are being set up in residential areas in violation of international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, the fact that strikes on energy and transport infrastructure are being promoted and ramped up by Zelensky himself, something for which he regularly receives painful response strikes for, this is something none of the organizers of today's meeting mentioned. Instead, we heard more fables about so-called kidnapped Ukrainian children, kidnapped by Russian, although evidence of this is something Ukraine has not provided. The truth is that against the backdrop of thousands of Ukrainian children in Russia, Kiev, in practice, at our behest, could only provide information about 399 children, information about many of which did not check out upon investigation. In other words, the topic of children is a mendacious propaganda topic which Europe is trying to use to manipulate public opinion and to demonize Russia. Hence, it's no better than the staged show in Bucha. Assertions about Russia's involvement in Bucha is something that neither Ukraine nor its Western backers managed to provide evidence of. The real attitude of the Kiev regime to Ukrainian children can be seen in the scandal unfolding in Ukraine, a scandal surrounding the transfer in 2022 of roughly 3,500 children, orphans, from the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast to Turkey via the Childhood Without War initiative, steered by the wife of the Ukrainian president, Elena Zelenskaya. In the spring of 2024, chilling facts came to light, facts about the psychological pressure these children were subjected to and to the improper treatment thereof. These children were systematically used in public propaganda events, and if they refused, they were starved. The police began to investigate this, the criminal proceeding. However, as is common in Ukraine, the case was swiftly closed, and they tried to hush up the scandal so as not to inconvenience those in power. As a result, none of the organizers of this project, under the patronage of Zelensky's wife, no one was punished. Nor do our compassionate European colleagues want to investigate this case, which outraged millions of Ukrainians. Obviously, children are simply a pretext for yet another anti-Russia campaign. Colleagues, we hope that in London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, they will finally come to their senses, but hope is scant. Today's meeting only serves as further confirmation of this. Too much is at stake for the elites in these capitals. The bubble of lies they've blown up surrounding the Ukrainian crisis and its root causes is simply too big. However, we should remember that what's in play is not only the ambitions and hang-ups of European Russophobes, but the fate of the world. After all, a military conflict between Russia and Europe, which Europe is doggedly pursuing, is unlikely to be a localized conflict. Washington now fully understands this, and we're grateful to our American colleagues as they are trying to make overexcited European brains get their heads around this obvious truth. We stand convinced that everyone should join these efforts, all those who genuinely believe in the ideals of peace, cooperation, and good neighborly relations, i.e., the very ideals Europe has forgotten about in their anti-Russian frenzy. I think today no one has any doubts about the fact that Russia will achieve the objectives of its special military operation in any event. The only question is, will we do this militarily or diplomatically? We reiterate that we prefer the latter course. Yet, due to the actions seeking to undermine on the part of European hawks, we do not see any serious prospects of this. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the Slovenian Presidency, to Your Excellency Foreign Minister Tanja Fajon, for convening today's meeting devoted to Russia's ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. I also wish to thank the briefers, Ms. Goto and ACG Msuya, for their presentations, and to Ambassador Lovrencic especially for your testimony. Regrettably, the 3 months that have passed since I last had the honor of addressing this distinguished council have not brought any relief to my country. On the contrary, the situation for Ukrainians has deteriorated dramatically as Russia intensified its terror campaign of strikes against residential areas and critical civilian infrastructure. These acts of state terrorism not only lead to hundreds of civilian casualties, but put the lives of millions on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe. If you recall, during our previous appearances here before the Security Council, I invoked the play Waiting for Godot by Nobel Prize winner Samuel Beckett. We implored this body not to fall into a state of endless expectation, not to wait for manda from heaven, for miracles, for better circumstances, for someone else to act, but instead to adopt a resolution mandating an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. Tragically, nothing has changed, or rather, the only thing that has changed is the scale of Russia's brutality, which brings suffering to millions of Ukrainians. Yet I will return to Samuel Beckett later in my remarks. Now I wish to reiterate with absolute clarity that Ukraine continues to expect this Council to adopt this long overdue ceasefire resolution. The full and unconditional ceasefire here and now would not only bring an end to the bloodshed, but might also serve as a first step toward rebuilding the minimum degree of mutual trust required to launch genuine, credible peace negotiations. And Ukraine has been standing ready for such steps for months. It is Russia who repeatedly rejects it. Madam President, at our previous meetings in this chamber, Ukraine has always presented the grim catalogue of attacks carried out against my country. The waves of ballistic and cruise missiles, the swarms of drones, the artillery barrages, the thousands of glide bombs that fall with mechanical regularity upon our cities and towns. Day after day, night after night, they take innocent lives and devastate civilian infrastructure. I will not recite new figures today. Experience shows that these numbers, however painful for Ukrainians, rarely move this Council to act properly. Russia sits on this table and continues to undermine its work. Those figures have become a kind of desolate arithmetic, cruel statistics of war absorbed without reflection, noted here without much consequence. What is an unbearable tragedy for us is perceived elsewhere as little more than a routine ledger of a distant conflict. Instead, I wish to focus on a question that carries far greater weight. Why is Russia still able to wage this brutal war against Ukraine? Why, nearly 4 years after launching its full-scale military invasion, does Moscow retain the material, financial, and political means to continue striking Ukrainian cities and killing civilians? And why does the international community still tolerated. The main reason Russia is still able to continue its war against Ukraine, producing weapons, missiles and drones that murder our children every day, is quite simple. Russia earns all the money to fund its war by exporting its energy resources, oil, gas and coal. In fact, if one looks at the data, the figures are no less shocking than the daily toll of civilian lives lost in Ukraine. The scale of revenue flowing into Russia is staggering, and it directly fuels the machinery of war that continues to devastate my country. Madam President, Russia earned roughly $270 billion from the export of its fuel last year. What is even more striking is how concentrated these revenues are. 3 countries alone account for approximately 75% of that income. 3 countries which serve as Russia's biggest energy customers are no secret to anyone in this chamber, I guess. For those who are still not aware, just Google it. If we place the numbers of energy imports side by side with Russia's military budget last year, estimated at around $145 billion, the picture becomes unmistakably clear. The purchases of Russian energy by just 3 biggest consumers exceeded by far the entirety of Russia's annual defense spending. In other words, due to the absence of UN-mandated sanctions, an absence ensured, of course, by Moscow's abuse of veto in this council, a number of states are effectively sustaining Putin's war machine through their growing imports of Russian oil, gas and coal. They keep on providing the Kremlin with the financial oxygen that ignites the fire of war. Madam President, of course, each of major importers of Russian fossil fuels will readily present arguments explaining why increasing their deliveries of Russian oil and gas is essential, even a noble undertaking, for the economic prosperity of their nations. Yet this stance is profoundly hypocritical, because on the other side of that coin lies an undeniable truth. The very revenues they justify as engines of development are the same funds that allow Russia to continue financing its barbaric war of aggression against Ukraine. These are the same funds that allow Russia to kill civilians and to erase towns from the surface of the earth. That is why Ukraine welcomes decisive steps taken recently by the United States of America aimed at targeting the largest Russian energy companies. We are confident that in months ahead, the pressure will have a tangible impact. Any reduction in Russia's ability to sell its energy resources strikes directly at its war chest. And it is not an abstraction, it is a direct link between every dollar that flows into the Russian budget today and the missile that falls tomorrow on an apartment building in Kiev. That is precisely the reason why Ukraine appeals to all our partners to align with this approach. We call upon the European Union, the United States of America, and all other peace-loving countries to introduce massive secondary sanctions against all those countries who keep supporting Russia's war-making machine. The broader the coalition of states that refuse to subsidize Russian aggression through energy imports, the sooner this war will come to an end. Once the flow of this dirty money begins to dry up, Putin will be the first to seek a ceasefire. His war depends on cash, as simple as it is. Cut the revenues and this house of cards collapses. This is why every effective sanction, every halted oil shipment, every contract not renewed truly matters. Distinguished members of the Council, in Russian folklore, there is a villain called Koshchei Besmertny, Koshchei the Deathless. He hides his source of life inside a very tiny needle, a single fragile point on which his power depends. Russia's war engine has its own needle, the petrodollars from energy exports. As long as that needle remains intact, the Kremlin believes itself immortal, untouchable, capable of endless expansion. But once we break it, once the flow of oil and gas money is curtailed, the illusion of Russia's invincibility will vanish like a dew in the sun. Just like in the old tale, the moment the needle snaps, the monster loses its power. Madam President, Ukraine would like to commend the recent peace efforts of the United States, especially the very intensive shuttle diplomacy of the last few weeks. We count on the strength and the mastery of US diplomacy, which could bring to an end the bloodiest war on the European soil since 1945. Ukraine reaffirms its readiness for concrete steps to restore a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. But let me be clear. Our territory and our sovereignty are not for sale. We are not at the Christmas bazaar. We are not at the infamous Cherkizovsky market. Russia wants Ukraine to capitulate, as we just heard. Russia wants us to surrender. But my reply to you would be, дырку от бублика получите вы, а не Украину. You will get just the whole of a bagel. Distinguished members of the Council, to conclude, let me again refer to Samuel Beckett. In his play Endgame, the world has already collapsed, yet its characters cling to empty motions as if mere repetition could restore normality. The protagonists speak, they argue, but nothing changes. They circle endlessly around the same gestures, the same rituals, the same illusions of control. It is a portrait of humanity after catastrophe, trapped not by physical ruin, but by a deeper paralysis of will. Samuel Beckett shows us that the true end begins not with destruction, but with the quiet surrender to inaction. And here, in this chamber, that wording feels, at least for us, unbearably close. For almost 12 years, Russia's brutal war of aggression has ravaged a sovereign nation, devouring lives in real time. Cities have been erased, children orphaned, millions displaced, and yet this Council often behaves as if it were Beckett's stage. Too often it moves as if on rails laid long ago, circling through procedures, returning to familiar debates, allowing Moscow to continue killing behind the mask of institutional blockade. Samuel Beckett teaches us that the final defeat comes when we accept absurdity as normal, when we grow accustomed to injustice and to human suffering. We cannot afford a Council that resembles a stage, a theater, where catastrophe is acknowledged but not really confronted. To end this terrible war demands more than eloquence. It requires the one thing Beckett's play refuses its characters: the courage to act before inaction becomes complicity, before history decides that this Council too has eventually reached its own endgame. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting, and thank you to the briefers for their informative interventions. Poland notes with satisfaction the renewed search for peace in Ukraine and intense diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the war. For almost 4 years now, Ukraine has been fighting a brutal full-scale Russian aggression that violates all fundamental principles of international law. To restore peace, we therefore need to look for a solution rooted in the fundamental principles that this organization and this Council were designed to protect. Unfortunately, our doubts about Russia's willingness to agree to a ceasefire and open comprehensive peace talks were proven true. Moscow sticks to its maximalist goals, which are the real root causes of this war, under which the Ukraine is pictured as deprived of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and de facto freedom. Accepting that would be a dangerous step backwards for global rules that keep us safe. If we want a lasting peace, we cannot agree to Russian conditions, simply because this would only encourage Moscow to continue its policy of aggression. What has to be mirrored in the peace framework is that Ukraine is a victim and Russia is an aggressor. Madam President, We back President Trump's call for an immediate end of the fighting and for negotiations to begin based on the present lines of control. We appreciate that Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to negotiate in good faith. However, Russia has yet to show similar commitment. Instead, President Putin is doubling down on war. Not only does he escalate attacks on Ukraine, but he is also issuing vicious threats that he is ready to take his war further into Europe. These threats leave no illusion. Russia is at most aggressive since the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. Despite its seat in the UN Security Council as a supposed guardian of the peace, it's choosing war instead. Madam President, let's not forget the terrible crimes committed by Russia. Thousands of civilians taken prisoner, tortured, raped and bombed. Thousands of children have been illegally deported. We are also concerned by the reports that kidnapped Ukrainian children are being taken to North Korean camps and indoctrinated. In this context, we note that with satisfaction the unity among member states of the UN in the protection of the rights of children and the last week's adoption of the General Assembly resolution urging Russia to ensure the safe return of all Ukrainian children it has forcibly transferred or deported. As the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has just reported, Russia continues to target energy, transport and healthcare infrastructure while winter conditions are worsening. These strikes are resulting in more power outages and disruption to the vital services nationwide. Russia's persistent attacks against civilians are not accidental. They are intended to inflict severe suffering and further deteriorate the humanitarian situation. Madam President, we will continue to support the brave people of Ukraine in their daily fights. We will not relent. The best answer to Russia's aggression is clear. We will keep providing Ukraine with the humanitarian, political, military and financial support. Let me reiterate, peace will only be real if it's based on international law. Any deal that rewards Russia's aggression would only lead to more war, not to the dearly desired stability and balance of power. We stand with Ukraine and with justice, and we are committed to peace built on fairness and law. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and my own country, Norway. We would like to thank DPPA, OCHA, and also ITF, Enhancing Human Security, for the very valuable briefings and remarks today. Madam President, Ukraine is facing what could be its toughest winter since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. In the midst of discussions on peace, Russia continues its relentless bombing campaign against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Every week, residential areas are targeted by missiles and drones, often at night when people are asleep. Attacks on Ukraine's energy system are causing blackouts and heating disruptions, putting millions of people at risk as temperatures drop. The strategy is plain for everyone to see: to break the Ukrainian people's resilience by depriving people of basic services and spreading terror. The position of the UN, save for this Council, has been clear. Russia's war of aggression violates Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, a clear breach of the UN Charter. Madam President, as we are approaching the 5th year of Russia's full-scale invasion, we have yet to see any genuine intention from Russia to end its war. Calls for a ceasefire have been met with indifference. Contrary, we witness how Russia escalates its rhetoric and presents unacceptable demands that run against the core of the UN Charter. It bears constant reminding that Russia started this war and can end it today. No matter how much Russia tries to spin the narrative, this fact is unchangeable. Russia's actions stand in stark contrast to Ukraine's constructive approach. No one wants peace more than Ukraine. Madam President, the Nordic countries support a just and lasting peace in accordance with international law, a peace that lays the foundation for security, stability, reconstruction, and prosperity, and which prevents new acts of aggression. A peace that ensures Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence as enshrined in the UN Charter. And the way this war is settled matters to all of us. If international law is pushed aside and Russian aggression is rewarded, the implications could be very grave. It would signal that changing borders by force pays off, that brutality trumps norms and rules, and this is why we will continue to insist on peace that allows Ukraine to prosper as a free and independent nation. Madam President, let me conclude by highlighting the human dimension of Russia's war. Last week, the General Assembly adopted a resolution demanding Russia to return Ukrainian children that have been forcibly transferred or deported. The Nordic countries were proud to co-sponsor this resolution because there are no justifications for adopting children. It violates the rights of the most vulnerable and reminds us of the horrors of Russia's war. And we take this opportunity to once again demand that Russia return the children to their families where they belong. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Norway for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We fully support the EU statement to be delivered in this meeting, and I would like to add a few points. The last Council meeting on Ukraine overwhelmingly called for a ceasefire as a first step towards peace in Ukraine. We reiterate strongly this call for a ceasefire. Despite intensive diplomatic efforts in the last days and weeks, Russia has yet to show the will to stop the war. As we speak, Russia's war of aggression continues on the ground. Russian missiles and drone strikes intensify, causing death and destruction. Across Ukraine, the plight of civilians continues. No region of Ukraine is safe against Russia's aerial strike. We strongly condemn Russia's latest attacks targeting, with hundreds of drones and missiles, Ukraine's energy, railways, and port system, as well as residential areas. Like the ones before, these recent attacks claim civilian lives, including children. The fate of Ukrainian children remains one of the most dramatic consequences of Russia's aggression. We welcome the adoption by the General Assembly of the resolution on return of Ukrainian children. We expect it to provide a renewed impetus, including through the good offices of the UN Secretary General, in addressing the situation of the Ukrainian children that have been forcibly transferred or deported to Russia. Madam President, Russia continues to violate the airspace of a number of Ukraine's neighboring countries, including my own country. Such reckless behavior has chilling effects for the lives and the security of civilians in these areas. Since our last intervention before this Council, new drone intrusions in our airspace were detected on 25th of November, and the remnants of a drone were found on Romanian soil. We again strongly condemn the repetitive violations of the Romanian airspace by Russian drones. The security of the Black Sea is of concern not only for our region, but for the global commercial routes. Romania has raised this issue in front of the Security Council since the export route of the grains from Ukraine was endangered by the war. We will continue to voice our concerns with regard to the security of the Black Sea region and the ports, the Danube ports as well, and the commercial sea and river shipping routes, and we will continue to support Ukrainian efforts. Madam President, the security of Europe and of all of us depends on the conditions of a future peace in Ukraine. Changing borders by force is unacceptable, and we cannot entrust an aggressor with a say on our freedom and security. Peace must not reward the aggressor. Romania welcomes the United States' continued efforts towards peace in Ukraine and commends Ukraine's genuine engagement in these efforts. It remains imperative to exert pressure to stop this war, including through sanctions and more concerted action under circumvention by Russia's shadow fleet. We need to achieve peace as soon as possible. My delegation reaffirms that the achievement of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace needs to be in line with the UN Charter and the principle of sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity applicable to all nations. And we reiterate our continued support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Romania for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We also align ourselves with a statement by European Union. I would like to thank the briefers for their most valuable input. Despite Ukraine's firm commitment to peace and despite repeated calls on Russia by the General Assembly and leaders across the globe to end its illegal war of aggression, the Kremlin continues its brutal assault on the sovereign Ukraine and the Ukrainian nation. We underline again that Russia's aggression is totally incompatible not only with the status and responsibilities of a permanent member of the Security Council, but also with those of any UN member state, undermining the principles of the UN Charter, as well as regional and global peace and security. While US-led diplomatic efforts continue, and all of us, including the Ukrainians, of course, hope that a full, comprehensive and immediate ceasefire will come sooner rather than late, the situation on the ground continues to worsen. The UN reports a steady rise in Russia's attacks against Ukrainian civilians and critical infrastructure. On 6 December 2025, Moscow launched at least 653 drones and 51 missiles against the people of Ukraine. The main targets were once again not military, but heating, energy, and transport infrastructure. This is yet another example of how Russia is desperately trying to break the spirit of Ukraine. Yet, Ukraine continues to be strong, resilient, and united, because its people are fighting for their own land, their own people, against an aggressor that they never sought. Thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children have been illegally abducted and deported to temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and Russia, Belarus, and even to DPRK. Last week, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for the immediate, safe, and unconditional return of children who have been deported to occupied territories and Russia. It got an overwhelming support, and we thank all member states that voted in favor of this resolution, upholding humanity and the principles of international law, including the UN Charter. Colleagues, Ukraine stands today as a symbol of the free world's resilience against imperialism and neocolonial tyranny. We call on all UN member states to step up pressure on Russia through stronger sanctions while increasing political, military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine, including urgent support for Ukraine's energy sector, systematically attacked by Russia. Only by increasing the cost of aggression on Russia, we are able to collectively force Russia to peace in Ukraine. And appeasement of dictators only leads to renewed aggression. Any credible peace deal needs to fully respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in its internationally recognized borders. And first step towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine should be an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Unfortunately, we do not see neither willingness nor any visible steps on Russian side that indicate that Kremlin starts moving towards a ceasefire, not to mention peace. Instead, it is clear that Putin's goals vis-à-vis Ukraine have not changed. Russia's imperial ambitions have always been characterized by particular cruelty and crimes against the victims of aggression, demonstrating a total disregard for human life, by way, including that of its own soldiers. Only in November, Russia lost approximately 31,000 soldiers. 31,000 soldiers in Ukraine. The total casualty count on Russian side is above 1.2 million. Above 1.2 million soldiers. And meanwhile, there are increasingly alarming reports about human trafficking from our countries to work in drone factories in Russia, and even for Russia's military. We call for Russia to allow UN and independent monitors in to verify all of these claims. And reality on a battleground is that Ukraine continues to fight back. There is not a single strategic level breakthrough achieved by the Russian side. In over 11 years, with all its military might, Russian forces have not been able to conquer the Donbas region. President, Russia and its leadership must be held accountable for the crime of aggression and other crimes committed in Ukraine. We call on all countries to join the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. It is also absolutely clear that Ukraine and Europe must be fully involved in any process aimed at achieving a peace in Ukraine. Only full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity can bring just and lasting peace in Ukraine, and therefore greater security and stability to Ukraine and Europe. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, nothing about Europe without Europe. These principles are still very much valid. Finally, let me assure you that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will continue to stand with Ukraine in all domains, resolute and unwavering. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Moldova.
Madam President, I would like first to express our gratitude to the Slovenian presidency for convening this important meeting. I also wish to thank the distinguished briefers for their meaningful contribution to the subject. The Republic of Moldova aligns itself with the statements of our partners who stand firmly in defense of the UN Charter, international law, and our shared security. Today, as the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine continues, we categorically condemn the Russian Federation's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified aggression against Ukraine. This war remains one of the most blatant violations of the Charter of the United Nations in decades. It continues to inflict immense human suffering, destabilize regional and global security, and undermine the foundation of the rule-based international order. From the first day of this full-scale invasion, Moldova has stood by Ukraine and by its people. We reiterate our full support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. Respect for these principles is the cornerstone of international peace and security, and their violation threatens every state represented in this chamber. Madam President, we are deeply alarmed by the continuous and intensified Russian missile and drone attacks against Ukraine's cities and towns, which have tragically resulted in the killing of civilians and the widespread destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, energy infrastructure, and cultural sites. As many speakers have stressed before, intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects or causing disproportionate civilian harm constitutes a war crime. This act must cease immediately, and accountability must be ensured for the most serious crimes under international law. The consequences of these attacks do not stop at Ukraine's borders. In recent months, we have witnessed a deeply concerning pattern of violations of the airspace of neighboring countries, a pattern that threatens to broaden this conflict and destabilize the entire region. Unfortunately, the Republic of Moldova has not been spared from the consequences of this conflict. On 25th of November 25, 6 Russian drones violated our airspace, prompting a foreign protest to the Russian Federation. These actions were condemned as absolutely inadmissible, representing a serious violation of Moldovan sovereignty and a direct threat to national and regional security. Such violations of our airspace have been registered multiple times in the past 3 years. Russia was called upon to respect international norms, including the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Moldova, and to take all necessary measures to prevent any recurrence. This incident underscores how the ongoing conflict in Ukraine continues to spill over, directly affecting our security and the safety of our population. Equally, We recall the recent unprecedented incursions of drone-type objects into the airspace of Poland, the armed fighter jets that violate Estonia's airspace, and repeated drone incursions over Romania. These are reckless, dangerous, and provocative actions that demonstrate a continued disregard for international law and for security of neighboring countries. Madam President, beyond its military dimension, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is accompanied by a broad and sustained pattern of hybrid operations targeting Moldova, aimed at weakening our institutions, dividing our society, and undermining our democratic processes. Our country has faced extensive campaign of disinformation, cyber attacks, covert financing and political actors, and attempts to destabilize public order. These hostile actions reflect the same disregard for sovereignty and international law that Russia demonstrates militarily in Ukraine. In response, the Republic of Moldova has taken decisive measures to strengthen its internal resilience, protect its democracy, and safeguard its national security. Under the leadership of the President of the Republic of Moldova, Maia Sandu, we have recently adopted a plan of strengthening democratic resilience for 26-27, which enhances information security, financial monitoring, cybersecurity defense, and international institutional cooperation. Our objective is clear: to ensure that the democratic processes of the Republic of Moldova take place free of foreign interference, and that our country remains stable, secure, and committed to its democratic path. Madam President, these developments remind us that the stakes of this war extend far beyond Ukraine. This is a test for the entire international community. To tolerate repeated acts of aggression, violations of sovereignty, and attacks on civilians would set dangerous precedents, encouraging further instability and in undermining the credibility of the UN Charter itself. Our collective resolve today will determine whether the principles enshrined in the Charter continue to guide international relations in the decades ahead. We therefore join other member states in calling on the Russian Federation to cease without delay its war of aggression, to halt all missile and drone attacks, to end provocations against neighboring states, and to withdraw fully and unconditionally from the territory of Ukraine. Escalation, maximalist positions, and disregard for international norms cannot pave the way to peace. Only a return to the fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter can create the conditions for a just and lasting peace in Europe. The Republic of Moldova remains committed to working together with all members of the international community to promote peace, accountability, and stability. We support diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, one that respects Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity and restores security to our region. Madam President, the Republic of Moldova will continue to stand with Ukraine politically, diplomatically, economically, and in solidarity with its people who fight for their freedom and for principles that underpin the international order. Our support is not merely an expression of neighborly solidarity, it is a defense of the very principles that ensure the security and dignity of all nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Moldova for the statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Madam President. It's great to see you. And thank you to the Presidency for convening this meeting, and thank you to our briefers for the clear statements on the consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and for their critical efforts in leading the United Nations political and humanitarian engagement in Ukraine. Colleagues, we find ourselves in a pivotal moment. The negotiations towards peace are accelerating as we speak. No one wants peace in line with the UN Charter more than Ukraine, the victim of Russia's illegal aggression for nearly 4 years. 4 years. After the adoption of Resolution 2774 on path to peace, Ukraine agreed to ceasefire back in March and continues to advocate for a just, comprehensive and lasting peace. The EU will sustain its diplomatic efforts towards such a peace together with the United States and other partners. But Russia continues its war of aggression with increasing intensity, showing no sign of any serious commitment to peace. It intensifies its attacks, cynically striking energy infrastructure as winter approaches, and targeting again civilians, including women, children, and humanitarian workers. These are not the actions of a party who wants peace. These are the actions of an aggressor who is determined to recolonize by force an independent member of the United Nations. Colleagues, every member of the Security Council has called for an immediate ceasefire to stop the killing and facilitate peace talks. Every member, that is, except for Russia. This is the moment to solidify that call. The UNSC may not have the power to force Russia to abide by Resolution 2774, but it has both the power and the ultimate authority to exert maximum diplomatic pressure on the only country that openly violates 2774 to finally stop the killing. President, we must never forget who bears the brunt of this war. For nearly 4 years, Ukrainian citizens have lived in fear of their very lives and of the safety of their loved ones. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, almost 7 million Ukrainians have registered as refugees, and a further 3.7 million are internally displaced. More than 42,000 civilians have been wounded or killed, including 2,500 children. Just last week, the UN General Assembly adopted a landmark resolution on the return of Ukrainian children. It calls on Russia to immediately ensure the safe return of all the Ukrainian children it has forcibly transferred or deported, and provides the Secretary General with a clear mandate to facilitate on this urgent humanitarian imperative. We thank the UN membership for its strong support to this critical issue and expect it will provide concrete progress, first and foremost, for children to be reunified with their families. Colleagues, almost 4 years into Russia's unprovoked full-scale war of aggression, it needs, I'm afraid, to be repeated. We cannot allow an aggressor state to attempt to change borders by force. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere. Aggressors must never be rewarded. Perpetrators must face justice. I am restating here a basic but fundamental principle of international law and the UN Charter. And all UN members should openly repeat this call and call out Russia accordingly. Some third countries and actors and entities therein that continue enabling Russia's war of aggression must be told to stop doing so. We condemn the continued military support provided by Iran, by Belarus, and by the DPRK, and urge all countries, including all members of this Council, to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia in its war of aggression. Dear colleagues, Russia must stop its war and agree to a ceasefire now. And all of us must reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. If we want an end to this unprecedented violation of the UN Charter, to this blatant injustice, and to the terrible suffering that it has brought on the ground, this is the one and only clear signal to send at this critical juncture. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. There are no names inscribed on the list of speakers. So the meeting is adjourned.